Sea Haven. Oregon was a place people came to forget or to be forgotten. Fog clung to everything: fences, boat hulls, even the tired faces of fishermen who, long after midnight, still nursed their grief at the water's edge. Tonight, the fog was thicker than memory. It curled over the yard's chain-link fence, seeped into Emily Warren's lungs, made her eyes sting as she stood alone beside the hulking shadow of a shipping container her father had once called the Old Warhorse. There were nights after the loss when she could almost believe she heard him, her father's footsteps crunching on gravel, the bark of his laughter echoing across the dock. But tonight, there was only the sea, the salt wind, and Max. Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd, sable and big-shouldered, moved like smoke at her side. For months he had been her only real company, a presence so steady she sometimes forgot how wounded he was beneath that sharp gaze. Tonight he was restless, pacing the shadows, head low, ears pinned. Emily's fingers drifted absently to the dog's neck, her mind clouded with the day's unfinished chores and the sharp ache of things unsaid. She wore an old navy jacket, the collar still stiff with her father's starch. Under the sodium lights, her face, early 40s, sun-faded, more lines now, was drawn and still. A gull screamed somewhere out in the mist. Max froze, hackles bristling, nose twitching at the cold air. Emily tensed too. He was always calm, Max, never one for theatrics. But now he lunged forward, claws scraping at the warped metal of a storage shed. He barked once, twice, the sound ragged, desperate, like something old breaking open inside him. "Easy, boy," she whispered. But the words barely left her lips before Max hurled himself at the base of the rusted door, paws digging, whimpering with a wild urgency Emily had never seen. Fog swirled, thickening. For a moment, Emily thought of ghosts, her father's, maybe, or her own. The emptiness inside her felt heavier than the night, heavier than the memory of last words left unfinished. She knelt beside Max. He pawed frantically at a seam in the metal, snout pressed to the cold, whining now, a thin note of need. Her hand found a patch of flaking paint. Beneath the corrosion, a symbol was carved, an anchor and compass, so faded she almost missed it. Her heart skipped. "Dad," she murmured, voice raw with a longing that startled her. With trembling fingers, Emily pressed at the edge of the panel. There was a click, then a hollow space opened inside the door. Max pulled back, watching her with eyes wide and wild. Inside the compartment, wrapped in waxed paper yellowed by decades, was an envelope. Her name, Emily, written in her father's careful, all-caps script. For a second, she couldn't move. The salt in the air felt sharper, the wind colder. She took the envelope out, thumb tracing the letters. The paper trembled in her grip. Max sat at her side now, posture rigid, tail sweeping slow arcs through the damp gravel. She glanced at him, a silent question, a request for courage. Thunder rolled somewhere out beyond the bay, low and tired. Emily tore the envelope open. Inside, her father's hand again, lines sharp and spare. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But you're not alone. There are things here I never told you, things that matter. Look in the office. Trust the dog." Max nudged her knee with his nose, a small sound escaping him, half whine, half warning. Emily's pulse raced, a mix of dread and longing. She looked back at the yard, at the faint outline of the main office, its windows blank and cold. For a moment, she imagined just turning away, letting the fog swallow her up along with all the unfinished business her father had left behind. But Max wouldn't leave the door. He pawed again at the carved anchor, claws scratching in the silence, then sat, watching her, as if waiting for a sign. The ache in Emily's chest flared. Grief, yes, but something more. A flicker of old duty. A memory of the girl she'd once been. Braver than this. She stood slowly, letter pressed tight in her palm, the fog swirling around her ankles, salt and rust thick in her breath. "Let's go, Max," she whispered, not trusting her voice. The dog rose instantly, at her side, every muscle taut, every sense alert to things she couldn't yet see. As they crossed the yard, the wind shifted, bringing with it the distant clatter of chains and the echo of waves breaking far below the pier. Emily paused at the office door, the envelope heavy in her jacket pocket. Max's head was low, ears up, gaze fixed on something beyond the darkness. She slipped inside, the night breathing on her neck. The walls, lined with nautical charts and black and white photos, felt closer than she remembered. On the desk, her father's battered thermos, the scent of cold coffee, and a pen rolled just out of reach, as if waiting for a hand that would never return. Emily leaned against the door, trying to steady her breath. Max pressed close, his body a wall of warmth against her trembling side. She drew out the letter, reading it again. The words pulsed in the hush. A last order, a plea for trust. Tonight would change her life. She felt it, the way the fog thickened, the way the dog refused to move from the door, the way her father's memory filled every empty space. And outside, somewhere in the mist, the world waited. Max's eyes never left the darkness. Inside the cramped, cold office, Emily stood as if rooted. Max circled once, then sat facing the door, his body blocking the entrance as though he expected the past itself to walk in. The walls pressed close. Overhead, the faint hum of the old neon bulb flickered in and out, tracing shadowy lines over her father's things, half a life in piles, receipts yellowed and curling, nautical maps. A faded photograph of a younger Emily perched on the bow of a long-soled fishing boat. She stared at the letter. Her father's words, "Trust the dog," sounded absurd, and yet tonight, nothing else made sense. She turned the envelope over and over, searching for another clue, until Max whined, a sound so soft it seemed to come from under the floor. Emily's gaze followed the dog's. There, beneath the desk, the floorboards were scraped raw, their finish worn away by years of boots and chair legs, or paws. She knelt, pressing her fingers along the cold edge of the floor. Her breath clouded in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the window, a sharp staccato like knuckles on glass. She found it, a loose board, barely wider than her palm. She pried it up, splinters biting at her fingers. Underneath, the shadows pooled deep. Max pressed in, nose quivering. She reached in blindly and pulled out a battered metal box, locked and cold to the touch. There was no key in sight. The room seemed to contract, walls holding their breath. Emily ran her thumb along the lock, the metal worn smooth from years of worry. On the lid, scratched and almost invisible, was a single word. For Emily. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the ache of the unknown. She set the box down, turning her attention to the desk. There, beneath a stack of logbooks, a small ring of keys, one long and thin, the others stubby and brass. She fit the longest key into the lock. It turned with a tired, stubborn click. Inside the box, a small leather-bound journal, a black-and-white photo of her father standing with a younger man she did not recognize, both in Coast Guard uniforms, both laughing in the wind, and wrapped in oilcloth, an old emergency radio. Emily lifted the radio, feeling its weight, the dials stiff with age. She pressed the power switch. Nothing. The batteries were gone. Max whined again, this time pacing a tight circle at her side, his eyes shifting from the door to the window, as if he too were waiting for something, or someone. She thumbed through the journal, pages filled with her father's tight handwriting. Log entries, storms, repairs, notes about the harbor, a list of phone numbers now faded to ghosts. Then, further in, more personal. Apologies never spoken. Memories of her mother's laughter, confessions of doubt, fear for the future. And one page set aside, marked with a scrap of blue fabric, her name, again and again, in rough block letters. Emily, if you find this, look for the light. Trust the signal. Trust him. Max sat abruptly, ears pricked. He stared at the old window above the desk, where rain had begun to tap in quiet insistence, a prelude to the coming storm. A sudden sense of urgency pressed against Emily's chest. She rummaged through the desk drawers until she found, in the bottom, a pack of fresh batteries meant for the radio. She fitted them in. The old device crackled to life, hissing static, the dial's red indicator trembling as she tuned through empty frequencies. And then, a sound. Faint, a stutter of Morse code echoing through the static. She froze. It repeated, then faded, then returned, growing louder. 3 long, 3 short. 3 long. SOS. Someone was sending a distress call. Max stood, tail lifted, eyes burning with purpose. Emily pressed the receiver to her ear, the code growing insistent, pleading. She jotted down the frequency, her fingers shaking. Who, after all these years, would be sending a distress signal on a forgotten channel? Was it a recording? A memory? A mistake? Or was someone somewhere in the cold, dark outside reaching for help? She scribbled the frequency and the time. Max paced the length of the office, pausing by the door, staring back at her, waiting. Emily pocketed the journal, slipped the photo into her jacket, and held the radio close. The storm outside broke open, rain hurling itself against the metal siding, wind howling through the cracks. The yard beyond the window vanished into wet, gray mist. She shut off the light and opened the office door. Max brushed against her leg, steadying her without words. She stood in the doorway, listening to the storm, the static of the radio, the dull ache of her father's absence, the living certainty of the dog at her side. Her boots splashed into shallow puddles as she crossed the yard, each step measured, as if the night itself might crack beneath her. The fog, thick as breath, swallowed the world whole. Max walked ahead now, leading not by leash or command, but by an instinct Emily no longer doubted. Halfway to the house, the radio crackled again. Help. SOS. Coordinates faint, lost beneath a wash of static. Max froze, muscles tight. Staring into the darkness beyond the last streetlight, Emily followed his gaze. Somewhere out there, beyond the fence, a figure moved. Just a suggestion, a shadow at the edge of her sight. The signal faded, returned, faded again. Emily clutched the radio, felt Max lean into her knee, a silent promise, a shield. She realized then that nothing in her life, her father's death, the lost years, the aching silences, had prepared her for this moment. But she was not alone. The dog's steady presence was proof of something she had almost forgotten, that even in the deepest night, something, someone, waits to be found. And in the dark, the signal called again. Wind rattled the window panes long after Emily returned to her dimly lit kitchen. Max's damp fur pressed against her legs as if he could anchor her there, in the warmth, in the known. The radio lay silent now on the table between an empty mug and the letter from her father. The battery drained, the last echo of static still humming in her ears. It was nearly midnight, but neither woman nor dog showed any urge for sleep. The old house creaked and shifted, the sounds as familiar to Emily as the thud of her own heartbeat. She'd lived alone here for almost a year. Alone. But for Max, whose silent watchfulness sometimes felt like the only thing keeping the world from collapsing in on itself. Rain lashed the windows in sheets, the sea's roar breaking against the docks in the distance. She moved around the kitchen in slow, deliberate circles, making tea she wouldn't finish, wiping already clean counters. There was no use pretending she could return to how things were before the letter, before the radio's crackle, before the signal cut through the fog and called her back to a place inside herself she'd been hiding from since the funeral. Max waited in the hallway, eyes glinting gold in the spill of light. He sat so still, it seemed as if he were carved from the silence, watching her with a patience she both envied and feared. She carried her mug to the small table by the window and looked out. The night pressed in, thick with salt and memory. In the glow of the streetlight, water pooled in the yard, running in slow rivers along the worn flagstones where she used to race her father from the porch to the gate, bare feet slapping wet stone. Max let out a small huff, a sigh almost, and shifted his weight. In the quiet, the world shrank. She traced the rim of her cup with one finger, the gesture so familiar it nearly broke her. The radio was still, but inside her, something had begun to stir, a restlessness, an old longing, the ache of unfinished business. She thought of the signal, the 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. She thought of the battered journal, her father's careful words. Look for the light. Trust the signal. Trust him. She felt the weight of Max's gaze, steady, unwavering, as if the dog alone remembered who she had been before the grief set in. The old kitchen clock chimed, thin and hollow. Midnight. Emily's phone vibrated once, a sudden trespass in the hush. The caller ID flashed unknown. She stared, pulse quickening, thumb hovering over the screen. She let it ring. Some silences are worth keeping. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. Emily rose, setting her mug aside. Max stood instantly, tail low, muscles tense. He trotted to the back door, nose pressed to the seam, body rigid. She flicked on the porch light. The fog had thickened, eating the edge of the world. Beyond the fence, the sea churned under a moonless sky. Something moved at the gate. A flicker, half seen, gone before she could name it. Max pressed harder against the door. She hesitated. Old habit told her to lock up, to retreat into the safe places grief had carved out for her. But she unlocked the door and stepped outside. Max at her heel. The cold wrapped her in its arms, clean and merciless. She stood on the porch, letting her eyes adjust, listening to the soft tap of rain on the railing, the distant groan of a buoy. Max moved to the steps, posture alert, head lifted. The world was a study in grays, yard, fence, alley, sea, sky blending together, all boundaries erased. Emily inhaled, slow and deep. Beneath the wind and water, she caught another sound, distant, metallic, rhythmic. It could have been a bell or a chain or Morse code again, faint, echoing between gusts. Max bristled, then turned to look at her, as if to ask, "Are you coming?" She followed him down the steps, boots splashing in shallow puddles. They crossed the yard, moving carefully, slowly, as if not to disturb whatever fragile spell held the world together. At the gate, Max paused, nose testing the air. Beyond the fence, in the murk, a shape materialized. Not quite human, not quite shadow. A man, or the memory of one, standing just out of reach. Emily's breath caught. She couldn't see his face, but something in the angle of his shoulders, the way he swayed in the wind, felt heartbreakingly familiar. Max did not bark. He moved forward, tail lifted, body language protective but unafraid. Emily kept her distance, one hand on the latch. The figure turned, as if to speak, then staggered just once, before disappearing into the dark between street and sea. Emily's knees almost gave. She pressed her forehead to the cold metal of the gate, eyes squeezed shut. When she looked again, only the storm remained. Max stood beside her, breathing hard. In the hush, the dog leaned into her, his head pressed against her hip, grounding her to the earth. She stayed there, letting the cold and the silence settle into her bones. In that moment, she understood what her father had meant. Sometimes the only thing left is to stand where you are, to face the night, to listen for signals only grief can teach you to hear. The house behind her glowed faint and golden, the kitchen light casting a halo on the rain-slicked path. Emily straightened, wiped her cheeks, and together, she and Max went back inside. Before bed, she opened the journal again, flipping to the marked page. The words shimmered in the lamplight. If you get lost, follow the dog. If you're afraid, let him lead. You'll find your way. I promise. Emily set the book down. Max curled at her feet, his body heavy, his presence more solid than any promise. The storm battered the windows. The house creaked and settled, old bones holding steady in the night. And for the first time in months, Emily let herself hope. Not for answers, not for miracles, but for the quiet courage to greet whatever the sea would bring at dawn. Morning on the Oregon coast always arrived slowly, as if the sun itself wasn't sure it wanted to break the spell of night. Emily woke with the sound of rain still whispering on the roof, the house cold, quiet, and unchanged. Max was already up. She could hear his paws on the worn hardwood, the soft thump as he circled once by her bedroom door, then waited. In the gray-blue dimness, the world outside seemed as distant as a childhood memory. She lay still for a moment, the heaviness of restless dreams lingering. The figure by the gate, last night, or perhaps just a trick of fog and longing, stayed with her, hovering between memory and doubt. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt, willing herself not to chase after what might have been, but to stand up and meet what was here. Downstairs, the kitchen was unchanged, the old radio where she'd left it, the empty mug beside the note in her father's hand. She let her fingers rest on the radio, hoping for another crackle, a hint of the code, but it was silent. The battery dead and the silence in the house nearly complete. Max nudged her elbow, then moved to the window, tail wagging in a careful, uncertain arc. She opened the back door and let him into the damp yard, standing at the threshold as rain tapped a gentle, persistent rhythm on the porch roof. The fog had not lifted. Across the grass, the sea was hidden by a veil of white and silver. Emily waited, hands curled around her mug, eyes tracing the pattern of water drops on the glass. She watched Max move through the yard, his body alert, head lifted, pausing every so often to sniff a patch of earth or glance at the fence, as if searching for something only he could sense. The morning felt balanced on a knife's edge, too quiet, too poised for ordinary life. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Dana, the harbor master's wife. Just 2 words. "You up?" Emily smiled faintly, replying with a thumbs up, but her thoughts were already wandering. She'd spent years practicing the art of distance, keeping herself just far enough from others that their questions couldn't reach her. But today, the ache of the unsaid, the weight of unfinished stories, pressed closer than usual. When Max returned, paws muddy, nose damp, he stood at her feet and stared until she knelt. There, in the mud on his chest and flanks, were streaks of something darker, rust maybe, or the trace of old blood. Emily's heart lurched. She ran her hand gently over his fur, searching for wounds, but found nothing. Still, something about the pattern, haphazard, not fresh, made her shiver. She cleaned his paws, filled his bowl, and watched as he ate in steady silence, his eyes drifting always to the back door, the gate, the sea. The morning unraveled, slow and silent. She made toast she barely touched, watered the faded plants on the windowsill. For a while she tried to lose herself in chores, sorting mail, folding linens, patching a loose thread on her jacket, but nothing stuck. Each task felt like waiting, each minute a reminder that life was happening somewhere just beyond her reach. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside washed clean but still shrouded in mist. Emily bundled into her jacket and boots. Max pressed at her side, tail wagging with a reserved hopefulness. She clipped on his leash out of habit, but let it slack, following as he led her down the gravel path toward the harbor. The docks were nearly empty, a few gulls picking at the last of yesterday's catch, the creak of a distant boat line straining against the tide. The salty air bit at her cheeks. Max walked ahead, pausing by the row of storage sheds, nose pressed to a crack in the siding. Emily stopped, her own breath fogging. She remembered the letter. Trust the dog. There are things here I never told you. She crouched beside Max, pressing her ear to the shed wall. At first, nothing, then a faint sound, a soft metallic clink, as if something was shifting inside. She fumbled with the lock, the cold making her fingers clumsy, but the padlock stuck, rusted tight. She stood, uncertainty gnawing at her. Was it all in her head? Was she following ghosts? Or was there truly a signal hidden beneath the ordinariness of this morning? Max leaned into her side, warm and solid. She let herself rest there for a moment, just breathing. The silence deepened. Then, from somewhere down the pier, a voice called her name, a low, hesitant, familiar sound. She turned, heart leaping, but it was only Carl, the night guard, waving with his usual half-smile, a thermos in one hand. "You left your lights on in the office," he said, voice muffled by his scarf. "Thanks," she replied, managing a smile she didn't quite feel. Carl tipped his cap and moved on, his footsteps echoing along the planks. She and Max lingered a while longer by the sheds, the sense of waiting growing heavier, the dog's gaze never leaving the door. Finally, the cold sent her home, Max trailing close behind. As she stepped onto the porch, she noticed something odd, a small object tucked behind the planter box, a key, old and brass, tied to a strip of blue fabric. Her pulse raced. She knelt, picking it up, the memory sharp, a piece of her father's shirt, faded but unmistakable. She held the key tightly, feeling the weight of every morning she'd spent searching for something unnamed. Max pressed his nose to her hand, breath warm on her skin. Inside, she slipped the key into the box she'd found beneath the office floor, turning it slowly, as if unlocking not just a lock, but a promise. The lid creaked open. Beneath the layers of paper and old receipts, she found a second radio, this one newer, a little battered but working, and a note in her father's hand, short and sure. "If you hear the signal, you'll know what to do. Trust Max, I always did." She closed her eyes. The house was quiet but not empty. Max rested his head on her lap, the morning light catching the silver in his fur, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the hush between heartbeats soften. There was no miracle, no grand answer, just the quiet, insistent presence of a dog who refused to let her drift too far from shore. Outside, the fog began to thin. Somewhere beneath the hush, she heard it, the faintest pulse of code, barely more than a whisper, but real. The fog hung thick as ever, clinging to the window glass and creeping through every seam of Emily's old house. But by midday, a pale sun began pressing at the clouds, a small mercy, a little gold thrown on the kitchen floor where Max stretched out, chin on his paws, tail making soft, slow sweeps across the linoleum. Emily sat at the table, elbows on a faded placemat, turning the brass key between her fingers. She could feel the echo of her father's presence in the wood and the dust and the quiet rhythm of the dog's breathing. She stared at the new radio for a long time before she turned it on. The machine was heavier than she expected, the volume knob stiff, its red indicator blinking like a faint, stubborn heartbeat. She tuned the dial slowly, not sure what she hoped to hear, a voice, a code, or only more static. What came first was silence, layered and dense, the hush of 100 empty channels. Then, just as she was about to switch it off, the pattern returned. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long, Morse for SOS. Not constant, not frantic, a patient, rhythmic pulse. Max's ears lifted, his body tensed with a quiet alertness that reminded her, again, how much he belonged to some world she could only guess at. She listened, hand tight on the table edge. The sound faded, reappeared, faded again, as if it came on a tide all its own. Emily wrote down the frequency and the exact time. She remembered her father's words. "If you hear the signal, you'll know what to do." But she didn't. Not really. She only knew she couldn't ignore it. Max rose and nudged her hand, his nose cold against her wrist, insistent without being anxious. He paced once, then settled by the door, tail thumping a question. She slipped the key and the journal into her jacket, pulled on her boots, and followed. Outside, the world was washed in pearl light, the grass heavy with dew, the air tinged with brine, and the distant cry of gulls. The path to the docks seemed longer today, each step deliberate, as if the whole town had fallen into the pace of her own slow heartbeat. Max walked ahead, not rushing, pausing now and then to sniff at the base of the old fence or look back, checking for her with eyes full of knowing. At the harbor, the boats rocked gently on a rising tide, ropes groaning against metal, the water below flecked with bits of driftwood and foam. There was no one about except Mrs. Levy, hunched over a crate of oysters, her breath blooming white in the chilly air. She waved, but did not call out, used to Emily's quiet ways. Max paused by the shed with the stubborn padlock, sniffing the gap beneath the door. Emily looked at the brass key. Her father's handwriting, the strip of blue fabric. She hesitated, the weight of all those quiet years pressing against her back. But Max looked up, steady, patient, something almost expectant in the line of his body. She tried the key. The lock gave with a tired click. Inside, the shed was colder than she remembered. The light fell in dusty stripes across old nets, stacks of cracked crates, the outline of a rusted anchor in the corner. The air smelled of salt and engine oil, the memory of storms and repairs. For a moment she simply stood there, letting her eyes adjust, letting Max wander the perimeter, his nails clicking soft and certain on the concrete floor. She spotted a box tucked against the back wall, almost hidden by a tarp and coils of rope. She pulled it into the light. On the lid, taped beneath a square of plastic, was another note. For Emily and Max, when the time comes, trust yourself. The sea keeps its secrets, but not forever. Emily's throat tightened. She opened the box. Inside were a pair of heavy-duty flashlights, a battered first aid kit, and a map. Hand-drawn, edges curled, lines inked in her father's old, neat script. Along the coastline, certain places were circled. Old Light, Fisherman's Jetty, North Point. The places she and her father used to walk in the winters after her mother died, when the silence of the house was too much to bear. She spread the map on the crate. Max watching, ears forward, head cocked as if remembering those same walks. On the margin, a single line. When you hear the call, follow the fog. Someone will be waiting. A gull shrieked outside, the cry sharp and wild. Emily flinched, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd let herself hope for anything that might arrive from the unknown. She folded the map carefully, pressed the box shut, and looked down at Max. He was sitting now, eyes unwavering, a living anchor in a world that kept shifting under her feet. They left the shed as quietly as they'd entered, the door closing on dust and memory. At the edge of the docks, Emily paused. The radio in her pocket buzzed just once. A signal, a reminder, the faintest heartbeat of someone reaching out through fog and distance. She let herself listen. She let herself be still. For the first time, she felt the beginning of movement inside her. Not resolution, not clarity. Just the sense that maybe, if she let the dog lead and followed the call beneath the fog, she might find something, someone, neither lost nor waiting, but simply present, just as Max was, here, now, beside her. She looked down. Max nudged her hand, and together they turned toward home, in the hush before evening, as the sun slipped behind a bank of clouds. Emily watched Max settle by the window, gaze fixed on the shifting gray outside. She sat on the worn sofa, map open in her lap, her heart quiet, her breath slow. The fog pressed close, but inside the small house, a different kind of stillness grew, a space where absence could breathe, where memory did not ache, and where, finally, the world felt less like a question and more like a promise waiting to be kept. Night drifted in quietly, the fog so thick it pressed against the windows, blotting out even the porch light. In the muted yellow of the living room, Emily traced the lines on her father's map for the 100th time, the tips of her fingers lingering over each circled spot, every margin note. The radio sat on the coffee table, silent now, though she checked it again and again, waiting for the next whisper of code. Max slept curled at her feet, chest rising and falling with a peace she envied but couldn't mimic. Outside, A breeze rattled the hydrangeas in their pots. Emily let the silence settle around her, aware of each creak in the old house, the ticking of the wall clock, the warmth of the dog at her toes. She'd always been good at silence, better than most. After her mother died, after her father's grief settled into stubborn routines, Emily learned to carry her pain in the quiet spaces. Even now, she found it easier to move through the world as a shadow, to speak only when she had to let silence say the rest. Tonight, though, silence wasn't empty. It was weighted with memory and possibility. She thought of the voice calling her name on the docks, the glint of the brass key, the old message on the map. When you hear the call, follow the fog. Someone will be waiting. She pressed her palm flat on the page, letting herself breathe slowly. Max stirred, lifting his head. In the hush, she heard it. A faint, metallic tap, so subtle she might have dismissed it as the settling of the house, if not for the way Max's ears pricked. His body suddenly taut with alertness, she stood, heart thudding. Max moved to the door, body low, posture neither fearful nor aggressive, just awake, all senses tuned to the present. Emily flicked on the porch light. The yard was nothing but shadow and moving mist, rainwater shining in little pools along the walk. She opened the door and stepped onto the creaking boards, the night air bracing and raw. There, at the edge of the steps, a small object gleamed in the yellow light, an old dog tag, half buried in the mud. Emily crouched, Max beside her, and brushed the earth away. The tag was oval, battered, the engraving worn but still legible. A number, a name. Her father's first canine partner from decades ago. A dog she barely remembered except in stories. Somehow, impossibly, the tag had found its way to her doorstep. She cradled it in her palm. Max sniffed at it, then pressed his head into her side. It felt like a sign, or maybe just a gentle nudge from a past that refused to be boxed away. Emily closed her eyes, letting the moment settle in. The fog pressed close, not menacing, but intimate. A blanket pulled over the house and its memories. She returned inside, setting the tag next to the map. In the lamplight, both looked suddenly less like relics and more like instructions. Max stood by the door, eyes following her, waiting. For what? A decision, a word, a walk into the unknown? She pulled on her jacket, slipped the dog tag and map into her pocket. Max's tail gave a single, determined wag. They left the house together, steps muffled on the wet earth. No destination, just the old road curling along the bluff, the sound of the sea below, the lights of the harbor distant and blurred by mist. The night wrapped around them, thick with the scent of salt and moss. They walked in slow, steady rhythm, Max at her side. Past the dock, where her father's shadow still lingered in her mind. Past the sheds, the padlocked gates, the boats bobbing like memories in the dark. At every fork, Max paused, looking back, and she let him lead. There was trust, old and unspoken, threaded through the leash, even though the leash itself hung loose, more symbol than restraint. They stopped at North Point, the wind stronger here, the cliff face black against the sky. The fog parted for a moment, revealing the path down to the rocks, a trail they hadn't walked since the funeral, too steep and too tangled with memory. Max moved forward, nose low, body humming with quiet purpose. Emily hesitated, but followed. The rocks were slick, the path uncertain. At the bottom, waves crashed and retreated, their rhythm as ancient as her grief. Max led her to a hollow between two boulders, sheltered from the worst of the wind. He sat, gaze fixed on the sea, as if waiting for something to rise from the water and call them both home. Emily sat beside him, drawing her knees to her chest. The air was full of the hush before words, the kind of silence that's more than absence. She felt the warmth of Max pressed to her side, the old dog tag cold in her pocket, her father's map folded tight in her palm. She closed her eyes and listened, not for a signal now, but for the shape of her own heart, for what might finally fill the ache left by years of unfinished sentences and unopened doors. She let her hand rest on Max's back, felt the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath fur. She breathed in the scent of sea and rain and old leather. The fog curled around them, and for the first time, she didn't mind the not knowing, the slow movement of night, the feeling that something was changing, quietly, at the edge of her life. They stayed until the cold crept into her bones, until the tide changed, and the first hint of dawn found its way through the mist. Only then did Emily stand, her knees stiff, her spirit strangely lighter. Max led her home, not hurrying, simply sure. As they reached the porch, she realized she had spoken not a single word the whole night, and yet she hadn't needed to. Sometimes, she thought, silence is the answer. Sometimes, letting the world speak through the dog at your side is enough. Inside, she placed the dog tag and the map on the kitchen table, a small offering to memory and to hope. Max settled by the door, eyes closing, body relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in weeks. Outside, the fog began to thin, and in that fragile space between night and morning, Emily allowed herself, at last, to believe in beginnings again. Dawn crept in, slow and uncertain, rinsing the world in a faint silver that clung to every branch, stone, and shingled rooftop. The fog was lifting, though just enough for the house to find its shape again on the bluff. Emily watched from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug gone cool, the taste of sleep still lingering on her tongue. Max dozed by the door, one ear cocked, paws twitching now and then, chasing some old memory in his dreams. She hadn't slept much. When she did, it was shallow, the kind of sleep that gathers just beneath the skin but never truly settles into the bones. The walk to North Point, the feel of Max's steady weight against her, the salt in the air, those things had calmed her in a way nothing else could. But her thoughts, like the sea, refused to be still. Morning spilled through the window in thin blue slants. Emily moved about the kitchen in silence, rinsing yesterday's mug, peeling an orange, setting half in Max's bowl just the way her father used to when he was trying to coax appetite from an old dog too tired for breakfast. Max roused, nose twitching, eyes soft and unsure. He stretched, joints creaking, then padded over, tail wagging once before settling in a slow, sweeping arc. She sat across from him, letting the quiet wrap around them both. There was no need for hurry. For the first time in years, she felt no urge to fill the day with tasks, to scrub away grief with lists and errands. The fog would lift in its own time. So would she. A breeze pushed through a crack in the window, cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of tide pools and distant pine. Emily watched a single gull wheel over the water, white wings flashing in the new sun. She thought of her mother's hands, smoothing wet hair from her forehead on nights she couldn't sleep. Of her father's rough laughter at the kitchen table, a sound that used to echo all the way to the porch. The house felt full of them, not as ghosts, but as presences woven into the wood and the light, always just out of sight. On the table lay the dog tag and the old map, creased now from the way her fingers had traced its edges, searching for a message she could read. The radio, silent, held a promise of sound, of another signal, another chance. She let it be, refusing to chase it, just for now. Max finished his orange, licking the bowl clean with careful dignity. He sat beside her, head pressed to her knee. She reached down, resting her palm on the thick fur between his shoulders. The warmth there was steady, almost fierce. His heart thumped in quiet counterpoint to her own. Later, when the sun crept higher and the fog retreated to the furthest edge of the yard, Emily slipped on her jacket and boots. The leash hung unused by the door, but she picked it up out of habit, looping it in her palm. Max waited, patient, his whole body a question mark. They walked the old route along the bluff, past the blackberry brambles and the weathered sign warning of loose rock. The world was fresh with rain, puddles shining like coins at their feet. Emily let Max choose the path, letting go of the leash as they reached the wild grass above the beach. Down below, the tide was coming in. Waves pressed against the sand with a gentle insistence, bringing with them seaweed, driftwood, and the broken glass of old bottles. Emily stood for a moment on the crest of the dune, the wind pulling at her hair, the breath of the ocean filling her chest. Max sniffed the air, his body alive with old instincts, tail held high. She followed as he trotted toward a tangle of logs pushed high by some winter storm. There, half buried, he began to dig, not frantic, but with purpose, as if memory itself was guiding his paws. Emily watched, heart thumping, letting him work. The sand gave way easily. Soon, he unearthed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, heavy and familiar. Her breath caught. She knelt, fingers numb with salt and cold, and pulled the bundle free. Inside was another map, this one newer. The handwriting, not her father's, but her own, from a summer long gone. She remembered making it with him, marking every place they'd found washed-up shells, every tide pool with starfish, every driftwood fort. The memory was sharp and sweet, sunburn on her shoulders, her father's hand guiding hers as she traced the coastline. Max sat beside her, tongue lolling, his eyes bright in the pale morning. She spread the map over her knees, tracing the faded lines, letting herself remember not just the places, but the feeling of being safe, being known. The ache inside her softened, the sharpness dulled by the weight of the dog at her side, the wind in her hair, the morning finding its way through the clouds. They lingered there, the sea humming its slow, ceaseless song. Emily leaned back against the driftwood, face turned to the sky. She let her hand rest on Max's head, fingers tracing the old scar above his brow, the place where time and kindness had worn a hollow in his fur. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The day lengthened. People passed on the distant road, shapes moving between fog and sunlight, not pausing, not intruding. Emily watched them come and go, felt the peace of being unseen, unhurried, held in the gentle gravity of the shore. She dozed for a while. Max curled tight against her side, their breathing slow and in sync. When at last the sun broke through, warm and golden, she gathered the map, dusted the sand from her jeans, and stood. Max roused, shook himself, then looked to her, waiting for the next step. They walked home in the long, low light. The house, when they reached it, was full of warmth. Emily hung the new old map beside the kitchen window, the dog tag gleaming softly on the sill. Max settled by the door, sighing into the quiet. Emily made tea, set the kettle to sing. She stood for a long time with her hand on his head, feeling the slow, deep rhythm of his heart, like the tide, like memory, like hope. Even as night returned, the fog now gentle and pale, the world felt changed beneath her skin. Not fixed, not solved, but softer. And as Max pressed close, she finally let herself rest, not to forget, but to remember without fear. The days grew brighter, almost imperceptibly, as if spring was negotiating its way back into the world, first with a hint of gold on the edge of a puddle, then with the scent of cut grass drifting in from the next yard over. The fog still came most mornings, but it was gentler now, rolling in soft like memory rather than pressing in hard like regret. Emily rose each day before the alarm, letting herself stand at the window, mug in hand, watching the first blush of color climb the eastern sky. Max seemed to change with the season. He was never a puppy, never careless, but these mornings found him looser, more open, sunning himself on the back steps or chasing the flicker of a shadow as gulls wheeled over the empty lot. He carried his own history in the old wound above his right paw, the way he sometimes startled at the crack of a branch or the clang of a dropped pan, but even those ghosts seemed less sharp as the light lengthened. Emily settled into new rhythms. She walked the harbor path each afternoon, her boots marking steady tracks in the gravel, Max at her side. Sometimes they paused at the edge of the pier, the water below black and glassy, a single heron balanced on a piling. Other days they walked out toward North Point, letting the wind comb their hair, letting the sky stretch overhead, vast and blue and promising nothing but itself. Inside the house she moved with less caution. The kitchen grew warm with the smell of baking, banana bread, cornbread, simple things she hadn't made in years. She found her mother's old apron, the one with faded flowers and a stain from blackberry jam, and wore it not as a shield, but as a quiet tribute. When the timer chimed, Max appeared in the doorway, tail high, hopeful as always. She broke off a corner of bread for him, and he ate it slowly, savoring each crumb. The radio sat mostly silent now, the battery finally dead. The last of the Morse code a memory more than a message. She didn't replace it. The map remained pinned by the window, the dog tag glinting in the morning sun. Sometimes she ran her thumb over the smooth, worn metal, letting herself imagine the stories it carried. Her father's voice on the wind, the shape of a dog long gone, waiting somewhere just beyond the edge of knowing. Emily's hands grew steadier with each passing day. She fixed the gate at the end of the yard, patching the hinge with wire and a square of driftwood. She swept the porch, planted nasturtiums along the fence line, trimmed the dead branches from the apple tree behind the shed. Each task was small, almost invisible, a way to root herself in the present without forcing the past out the door. Max followed her everywhere, content to simply be near, to lie in the patch of sunlight she left behind, to wait by the shed while she checked the old padlocks. Once, on a bright afternoon, he paused at the foot of the stairs, nose in the wind, tail stiff. Emily crouched beside him, feeling the shiver of anticipation run through his body. She waited, hand resting on his back, until the feeling passed. A ripple, nothing more. They walked on. One evening, after a day of wind and sudden showers, Emily sat on the porch steps, feet bare, mug warming her hands. The light was long and gold, the whole world briefly suspended. Max lay with his head on her knee, eyes half closed. She listened to the town settling, someone dragging a bin across gravel, the muffled thump of a car door, the distant call of children playing on the next block. There was nothing urgent in the air, nothing left undone that could not wait. She let her thoughts drift to the sound of her father's laugh at the kitchen table, the weight of her mother's hand on her shoulder, the stories she once made up about pirates and storm chasers and lonely ships finding their way home by starlight. She realized she could remember now without flinching, without closing herself off behind old routines. The ache was still there, but it was softer, an old bruise, not an open wound. Twilight settled. The sky turned lavender, then navy, then black. Emily rose, patting Max's side. They walked inside together. She closed the door and let the quiet in, letting it settle into the corners of the house. She washed the mug, turned off the porch light, wound the old kitchen clock. Max circled his bed twice, then curled up, tail wrapped over his nose. In bed, Emily opened her father's journal, letting her eyes trace the worn ink, the uncertain lines, the moments of hope tucked between lists of repairs and weather notes. She closed the book with a soft sigh, pressing it to her chest, listening to the steady heartbeat of the house. Somewhere in the night, rain came again, a hush against the windows, the sound of all things passing and returning. She turned toward the open window, breathing in the damp, salt air. Max lifted his head once, listening, then lowered it again, trusting the silence. And in the dark, Emily felt the old longing quiet for the first time in years. There would always be questions about the past, about what the signals meant, about what waited at the far edge of memory. But tonight, in this room, in this hour, it was enough to simply be here, to rest with the dog at her side, and to let the world spin gently forward. Dawn came quietly, finding Emily already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in the gray half-light, her hands folded around the old dog tag. The air was still, the house gently ticking as it settled around her. Max lay stretched on the rug, chest rising and falling, his breathing the only true sound in the quiet. She didn't reach for the radio anymore. The last message, that faint SOS in Morse, was months behind her now, faded to a memory softened by time and new routine. The signals had taught her something she could never quite name, a way of listening not for answers, but for presence, a way of being still. This morning, something in the air felt different. The quiet more gentle than empty, Shakshana. The yard gleamed wet and clean from the night's rain, dew shining on every blade of grass. Emily wrapped her father's old cardigan over her shoulders, padded out onto the porch with Max close behind, his gait slower, but certain. They watched as the sun climbed, not in a rush, but with a patience she'd only recently learned to trust. Gold broke over the garden fence, spilling in slow pools across the porch floor. Max leaned against her leg, warm and steady. She pressed her palm to his head, tracing the old scar above his brow, feeling the thrum of life beneath her fingers. The smallness of the moment, her hand on the dog's fur, the way the sun caught the dust in the air, the sound of her own breath felt enough, for once. She sat there, letting the world arrive, detail by quiet detail. The hum of bees, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the low whistle of a kettle inside. By midday, Emily found herself pulling open windows, letting fresh air spill through the rooms, chasing out the last corners of winter's heaviness. She gathered sheets from the line, folded them with slow hands, let her mind drift. Max padded after her from room to room, content in her company, sometimes pausing by the back door, nose lifted to catch some distant scent, eyes half closed in the sun. She thought often of the women and men who had come before her in this house, of her mother, standing barefoot in the kitchen shelling peas, of her father, oil-stained hands fixing a leaky pipe, whistling a half-remembered tune. Each memory was sharper now, less burdened by longing or regret. There was sorrow, of course, but it was woven with gratitude, a gentle acceptance, a willingness to let the past be what it was. That afternoon, Emily took Max down the bluff path, the one that traced the edge of the wild grass toward North Point. The sea was restless, sunlight breaking its surface into shards of blue and white. They walked slowly, stopping often. She watched Max move with the patience of old dogs, each step measured, each pause deliberate, as if teaching her again the art of taking life one moment at a time. At the rocks, Emily sat, letting the wind pull at her hair. Max curled beside her, sighing deep and low. She closed her eyes, breathing in the brine, the far-off call of gulls, the hush of waves below. A memory rose, unbidden, a night years ago, sitting on these same rocks with her father, watching the stars wink into being. He'd told her then, in his quiet way, sometimes you only see what matters by sitting still long enough to let the dark pass. She opened her eyes, glancing at Max. He watched the sea, eyes reflecting the light, the horizon. They stayed a long time. She let herself be carried by the ordinary miracle of sitting together in the sun, of feeling the years soften their grip. Later, back home, she found herself tidying the house, not out of restlessness, but care. She polished the kitchen table, set the old map flat beneath the glass, traced the coastline with her finger. The dog tag lay beside it, worn smooth. She ran her thumb over the engraving, a silent thank you, a blessing spoken with hands rather than words. Evening came with a hush. Emily cooked a simple meal, vegetables, a bit of fish. Max ate at her feet, tail thumping a steady rhythm against the floor. They sat together as the light faded, the rooms filling with the blue of dusk, the air cooling and sweet. Before bed, Emily stepped outside one last time, letting the night wrap around her. The stars were out, clear and unhurried. Max lay beside her on the porch, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. She listened for any signal, any message in the dark, but there was only the quiet, the breeze in the grass, the sound of her own heart. She realized then that what she had learned, through the signals, through Max, through loss and quiet and morning light, was not about finding or being found. It was about staying with the silence, with the dog, with the moment as it is, not waiting for rescue, not searching for something to fill the ache, but allowing herself, at last, to remain. Emily went inside, Max at her heel, the night closing gently around them. The light from the kitchen window spilled onto the grass, a small, steady beacon. She left it burning as she settled beneath her quilt, the dogs breathing slow and sure beside her bed. And in that light, in that hush, Emily finally understood. Some journeys aren't about leaving or arriving, but about having the courage to stay, to witness the turning of seasons, to hold the hand or the paw of what remains, and to find, quietly, that you are no longer lost. Some endings come quietly, arriving on the heels of ordinary days, disguised as nothing special. The first hint was in the garden, a slow unfurling of green after the long hush of winter. Crocuses broke the soil near the porch. Max found them first, his nose nudging the damp earth, tail flicking with faint surprise. Emily watched from the steps, coffee cooling in her hands, and let herself smile, not because she expected anything, but because the sight of new life, no matter how small, was enough. Weeks slipped by, each day a little brighter. The fog, once so dense and heavy, thinned earlier and returned later. The world outside seemed to breathe easier, and so did the house. Emily kept her routines gentle, tending the garden, walking the bluff path, baking bread she sometimes shared with the neighbors' children. She'd learned to listen for the small, wordless things, the creak of floorboards at dawn, the warm weight of Max's head on her foot, the distant whistle of the mailman she'd never spoken to, but always nodded at through the window. Max slowed a little with the season, his face more silver, his gaze softer. He no longer dashed for the beach, but walked there at a pace that made time stretch, every footstep deliberate, each pause meaningful. Emily adjusted her stride to match. She never hurried him. They understood each other without a word. Some mornings, she sat beside him in the sun by the kitchen door, hands resting on his back, feeling the rough warmth of his coat and the old, slow thump of his heart. She spoke softly, sometimes only in her head, about the years before, the mistakes made, the small mercies gathered and kept. She told him of the signals she no longer waited for, the letters she finally let herself throw away, the ache that softened day by day to something bearable. One evening, rain swept the town, clean and cold. Emily stood at the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Max lay in his bed, ears twitching at the thunder, but otherwise untroubled. She remembered the first days, the unease, the waiting for answers, the ache of loneliness that bit sharper than any winter wind. Now, as the house glowed gold with lamplight and the smell of baking, she realized she hadn't felt truly alone in months. That night, sleep came easily. In the blue dark of early morning, she woke to the sound of Max rising and padding to her side. He pressed his nose to her palm, an old, silent request. She stroked his head and let her hand linger. There was something different in his posture, a kind of release. She understood, without fear or urgency, that the years were doing what years must do. Dawn broke, slow and gold. Emily dressed quietly and opened the door to the yard. Max stepped outside, sniffed the air, then sat in the crocus patch, his eyes reflecting the early sun. She joined him, letting the dew soak through her socks, not minding the chill. They sat together until the sun was well up and the fog gone. The days that followed took on a special clarity. Emily called her sister for the first time in years. She invited Dana and her children for tea, watching laughter fill the corners of the old house. Max greeted each guest with careful dignity, accepting pats and treats, then settling near the door to keep watch, the way he always had. Spring became summer. The garden bloomed in wild abandon, nasturtiums climbing the fence, the apple tree putting out small, hard fruit. Max tired easily now. Emily let him rest, lying beside him on the porch, reading aloud from her father's journal, or simply sitting in the hush, both of them content to listen to the bees and the wind. She understood, in a way she never had before, that not every story needs an answer. Some are meant to be witnessed, some are meant only to be shared. One night, the old dog dreamed, his paws running, a soft whimper in his throat. Emily woke, sat beside him, and rested her hand on his side until his breathing slowed. She whispered thanks for every day they'd been given. The last morning came with no drama, no signal, only the steady turning of the world. Emily woke to the familiar emptiness of the house, but she did not feel alone. She found Max in his bed by the door, eyes closed, body at ease, gone as quietly as he had lived. She sat with him for a long time, stroking his fur, letting her tears fall without shame or resistance. She buried him under the apple tree, in the spot where the sun was warmest and the earth soft. She marked the place with a stone from the beach. Her father's dog tag looped on a piece of driftwood nearby. The garden, in its wild fullness, seemed to hold the moment with a gentleness she had never known before. That evening, Emily lit a lantern and set it on the porch, letting its glow spill into the mist. She sat in its circle of light, hands folded, the journal on her lap, the air alive with the scent of earth and salt, and the first stars coming out above the sea. She stayed long after darkness fell. There were no signals, no urgent questions, no ache of waiting, only the memory of footsteps on the old floorboards, the slow wag of a tail, the warmth of a life shared and well-loved. She understood, finally, that the most steadfast loves are the quiet ones. A dog that stays, a hand on old fur, the light left burning for someone who might return, or for the person you are, quietly coming home to yourself. In the fog and the hush, in the unremarkable miracle of this small life, Emily let herself rest. The world kept spinning, the lantern burned on, and somewhere in the dark, the old signals faded for good, leaving behind only the echo of belonging, a promise, gentle and true, that no one is ever truly lost when there is someone left to remember.